At 7:17 in the morning on August 6, 1945, Corporal Takeshi Nakamura sat in a concrete bunker carved into the hillside overlooking Hiroshima Bay, watching 3 small blips crawl across his oscilloscope screen. The morning shift had been quiet, almost peaceful, with nothing but scattered cloud formations drifting in from the inland sea. His superior officer, Lieutenant Kenji Yamamoto, stood behind him with a cup of weak barley tea, squinting at the same green glow that had become their entire world over the past 18 months of constant vigilance. 3 aircraft, flying at extraordinary altitude, approaching from the east. They had seen similar formations hundreds of times before, American weather reconnaissance planes that came and went without incident, too high to intercept, seemingly uninterested in the city below. What neither man could possibly know was that they were watching the approach of a weapon that would render every assumption they held about modern conflict instantly obsolete. In 43 minutes, everything they understood about the relationship between cause and effect, between the size of a threat and the scale of destruction, would be proven catastrophically wrong. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of those 43 minutes, told through the eyes of the men and women who watched, waited, and tried desperately to understand why the world they knew was about to end. It is a story about information and the terrible gap between seeing something and comprehending it, about the human mind's inability to process the unprecedented, and about how history sometimes arrives not with obvious warning, but disguised as routine. Corporal Nakamura had been stationed at the Hiroshima Army Marine Headquarters radar installation since March of 1944. He was 23 years old, a former mathematics student from Osaka who had shown aptitude for the technical demands of radar operation. The equipment he monitored was a modified version of the Tachi-6 system, capable of detecting aircraft at distances of up to 200 kilometers under optimal conditions. The technology was not as advanced as American systems, but it was reliable, and Nakamura had developed an almost intuitive understanding of its capabilities and limitations. He knew the difference between genuine threats and false returns caused by atmospheric conditions. He knew how formations typically behaved when they were scouting versus when they were preparing to engage in offensive operations. And on this particular morning, he knew that 3 aircraft at an altitude exceeding 9,000 meters posed no immediate danger to the city. Lieutenant Yamamoto reached for the telephone that connected their station to the Regional Air Defense Command. Standard protocol required reporting any contact, regardless of assessed threat level. The conversation was brief and businesslike. 3 high-altitude aircraft, bearing 270, estimated speed 500 kilometers per hour, no deviation from straight-line course. The officer on duty at Regional Command acknowledged the report with weary familiarity. Similar contacts had been logged almost daily for the past month. American aircraft came and went, photographing, measuring, observing. Sometimes they dropped leaflets warning citizens to evacuate. Sometimes they simply circled and departed. The massive bombing raids that had devastated Tokyo, Osaka, and dozens of other cities had largely bypassed Hiroshima, leading to widespread speculation about why the city had been spared. Some believed it was being preserved as a potential target for a new type of weapon. Others thought the Americans were saving it for use as their occupation headquarters after the inevitable surrender. Most people simply felt grateful and tried not to question their good fortune too deeply. At 7:25, the 3 blips separated on Nakamura's screen. 2 of the aircraft veered away to the north and south, while the 3rd maintained its direct course toward the city. This was unusual, but not alarming. Weather planes sometimes split formation to take measurements at different locations. Nakamura made a notation in his log and continued watching. The single aircraft was now approximately 80 kilometers from Hiroshima's center, still flying at maximum altitude. Lieutenant Yamamoto finished his tea and set the cup aside. He had been on duty since midnight and was looking forward to the end of his shift in another hour. His wife was preparing a special breakfast to celebrate their son's 5th birthday. Real eggs, obtained through considerable effort and expense on the black market. The boy had never tasted a real egg in his life. Across the city, the morning routines of approximately 350,000 people proceeded without any awareness of the single aircraft approaching from the east. Streetcars rattled along their routes, carrying workers to factories and offices. Students gathered in schoolyards for morning exercises. Housewives swept sidewalks and hung laundry on bamboo poles. Soldiers drilled in the courtyard of the Second Army headquarters, the regional military command center located near the center of the city. Hiroshima had been designated a military embarkation point, a staging area for troops being deployed throughout the Pacific Theater, and the military presence was substantial. But on this particular morning, the city felt less like a garrison than like any other Japanese urban center struggling through the final months of a devastating conflict that most people privately acknowledged was already lost. At 7:31, the single aircraft passed directly over the city at an altitude of approximately 9,500 meters, higher than any interceptor could reach, higher than any anti-aircraft gun could effectively engage. Nakamura watched the blip traverse his screen and continue to the west. For a moment, he felt a flicker of relief. Another reconnaissance mission. Another day of reprieve. He began composing the final entry in his morning log, describing the contact as routine and recommending no further action. But then the aircraft did something unexpected. It turned. Not a gentle curve toward a new destination, but a sharp, deliberate reversal, of course. The blip on Nakamura's screen executed what appeared to be a 155-degree turn, an aggressive maneuver that seemed entirely inconsistent with a leisurely reconnaissance flight. Nakamura sat forward in his chair, suddenly alert. He had never seen an American aircraft behave this way over Japanese territory. Reconnaissance planes maintained steady courses to ensure accurate photography. They did not make sudden turns without reason. Lieutenant Yamamoto stepped closer to the screen, his fatigue momentarily forgotten. The two men watched as the aircraft completed its turn and began flying away from the city at maximum speed. The behavior made no tactical sense. If the Americans had intended to photograph Hiroshima, why turn away before completing the pass? If they had intended to release bombs, why the extreme altitude and the absence of any bomber formation? Nothing about this contact matched any pattern either man had observed in 18 months of continuous radar monitoring. What Nakamura and Yamamoto could not see, what no radar system on Earth could detect, was the small dark object that had separated from the aircraft at the moment of its turn. Falling silently through the morning air, the object was approximately 3 meters long and weighed approximately 4,400 kilograms. It had been released from a modified heavy bomber named after the pilot's mother, and it contained the equivalent explosive force of approximately 15,000 tons of conventional explosives compressed into a sphere of uranium no larger than a grapefruit. The weapon had been given the designation Little Boy by the scientists who created it, a name that belied its capacity for destruction on a scale never before witnessed in human history. The object fell for 43 seconds, accelerating toward the city below. At an altitude of approximately 600 meters above the Shima Surgical Clinic in central Hiroshima, a barometric trigger initiated the firing mechanism. A conventional explosive charge drove a cylinder of uranium-235 into a target sphere of the same material, achieving critical mass. The resulting nuclear chain reaction released energy equivalent to the simultaneous detonation of all the conventional explosives used by all sides in the entirety of the conflict up to that moment. At 7:45 and 15 seconds, Corporal Nakamura's radar screen went white. Every dial, every indicator, every carefully calibrated instrument in the bunker simultaneously registered maximum values before failing completely. The lights went out. The ventilation system stopped. For a moment, there was only darkness and silence, broken by the distant rumble of something so vast and terrible that neither man had any reference point for understanding it. Then the shock wave arrived. The concrete bunker had been designed to withstand conventional explosive impacts, but the force that struck it now was not conventional by any measure. Nakamura was thrown from his chair and slammed against the far wall. Equipment crashed from shelves, ceiling panels cracked and rained down debris. The air itself seemed to compress and then expand with violent force. As if the atmosphere had momentarily forgotten how to behave, Lieutenant Yamamoto landed on top of Nakamura, shielding him inadvertently from a heavy metal cabinet that toppled where Nakamura's head had been a second earlier. For perhaps 2 minutes, neither man could move or speak. The rumbling continued, not a single explosion, but a sustained roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Nakamura's ears rang so severely that he could not determine whether the sound was external or internal. He tasted blood and realized he had bitten through his lower lip. Beside him, Lieutenant Yamamoto was struggling to breathe, his chest heaving with the effort of pulling air into lungs that had been compressed by the pressure wave. When Nakamura finally managed to stand, he stumbled toward the bunker's emergency exit, a heavy steel door that had been knocked partially off its hinges. He pushed through into morning light that seemed wrong somehow, tinged with colors he could not immediately identify. The sky above Hiroshima had transformed into a column of smoke and fire that rose higher than he would have believed possible, a pillar connecting the earth to the heavens with terrible majesty. The cloud at the top of this pillar was shaped like a mushroom, boiling and expanding with an organic quality that made it seem alive, like some enormous creature rising from the earth to survey the destruction it had caused. But what struck Nakamura most profoundly in that moment was not the cloud or the column of smoke. It was the silence. Hiroshima had been a noisy city, filled with the sounds of streetcars and factories and hundreds of thousands of human voices going about their daily lives. Now there was nothing. No sounds of traffic, no voices calling out, no birds singing. Just the crackling roar of fires spreading across what had been, moments before, one of the most populated urban centers remaining in the nation. Lieutenant Yamamoto emerged from the bunker behind Nakamura, his face streaked with blood from a gash on his forehead. The two men stood side by side, staring at the city they had been assigned to protect, trying to comprehend how one single aircraft flying too high to intercept, had wrought more destruction than all the massive raids that had devastated other cities over the past year. It was not possible. It could not be possible. And yet the evidence rose before them in a column of smoke that would remain visible for hours. That would be photographed and filmed and studied for generations. That would become one of the most recognizable images in human history. In the 43 minutes between the first radar contact and the detonation, approximately 350,000 people had lived their lives without any awareness that the world was about to change forever. Now, in a single instant, approximately 80,000 of them had ceased to exist, not been killed in any traditional sense of the word, but simply erased, their bodies converted to carbon and scattered across the ruins of their city. Tens of thousands more had suffered severe injuries from the heat and pressure and radiation that accompanied the explosion. The final toll would exceed 140,000 by the end of the year, with effects continuing to claim lives for decades to come. Corporal Nakamura would spend the next 3 days working without sleep, helping to coordinate rescue efforts and trying to make sense of reports that seemed to describe events from another world entirely. Survivors spoke of a flash brighter than the sun, of shadows burned permanently into concrete walls, of people whose skin had melted and hung from their bodies like torn clothing. Medical personnel had no framework for treating injuries they had never encountered before. Military officials had no protocols for responding to a weapon that did not fit any existing category of armament. In Tokyo, the initial reports from Hiroshima were met with disbelief and confusion. Communications with the city had been completely severed, not degraded or intermittent, but simply gone, as if Hiroshima had been physically removed from the map. A reconnaissance aircraft was dispatched to investigate and reported back that the city appeared to be on fire, but cloud cover prevented detailed observation. It was not until American radio broadcasts announced the use of a new type of weapon with unprecedented destructive power that Japanese leadership began to understand what had happened. And even then, the understanding was incomplete. The science behind nuclear fission was not unknown to Japanese physicists, but the practical achievement of weaponizing that science on a deployable scale had been considered years away, if not decades. Lieutenant Kenji Yamamoto never made it home for his son's birthday breakfast. He remained at his post for 72 hours, coordinating communications and trying to restore some semblance of order, to a situation that defied all military doctrine and experience. When he finally returned to his home on the outskirts of Hiroshima, he found it intact, but his family gone. They had evacuated to a relative's house in the countryside, having heard reports of strange illness affecting survivors of the explosion. The eggs his wife had obtained remained in their basket on the kitchen table, uncooked and untouched, a symbol of a celebration that would never occur. The two radar operators who had tracked that single aircraft for 43 minutes would spend the rest of their lives trying to answer a question that had no satisfying answer. What could they have done differently? The aircraft had been too high to intercept. The weapon it carried had been too revolutionary to anticipate. The standard procedures they had followed, report the contact, assess the threat level, recommend appropriate response, had been utterly inadequate for a weapon that rewrote all the rules of what was possible. They had done everything correctly, and it had made no difference at all. This was perhaps the most profound lesson of that morning. That expertise and vigilance and professionalism, all the qualities that had made Nakamura and Yamamoto good at their jobs, were meaningless in the face of a paradigm shift they could not have predicted. The future had arrived without warning, disguised as a routine reconnaissance flight, and all their training and experience had provided no defense against it. In the weeks that followed, Corporal Nakamura helped to prepare detailed reports on the radar tracking of the Hiroshima mission. These reports would later be studied by military analysts seeking to understand how the event had unfolded, minute by minute, from the first contact to the final detonation. The precision of Nakamura's observations, the exact times, bearings, and altitudes he had recorded, provided one of the most complete accounts of the weapon's approach available from the Japanese perspective. His data would be cross-referenced with American mission logs and used to reconstruct the timeline that has become standard in historical accounts of the event. But the numbers and timestamps, however accurate, could never capture what those 43 minutes had actually felt like for the men who lived them. The growing unease as the aircraft executed its unexpected turn. The confusion when the screen went white and the power failed. The moment of emerging from the bunker to witness a cloud that seemed to embody destruction itself, rising over the ruins of a city. These experiences existed beyond the reach of official reports and technical analyses, preserved only in the memories of those who had been present and in the accounts they would eventually share with families, historians and journalists, seeking to understand the human dimensions of what had occurred. Nakamura was eventually reassigned to a signals unit in Kyushu, where he finished the final days of the conflict monitoring radio traffic and waiting for the inevitable end. The surrender came 3 days after the second weapon was used against another city, when the emperor addressed the nation by radio and acknowledged that the enemy possessed a new and most cruel means of bringing the conflict to its conclusion. Nakamura listened to that broadcast in a concrete communications bunker, not unlike the one where he had watched the approach of the Hiroshima weapon, and he wept without shame. Around him, other soldiers wept as well, not from sorrow at losing, but from relief that the nightmare was finally ending, and from grief for all the people who had not lived to see it end. After the surrender, Nakamura returned to Osaka and eventually completed his mathematics degree at the university there. He became a teacher, spending 35 years instructing high school students in algebra and geometry, subjects that had concrete answers and provable solutions, a welcome contrast to the unanswerable questions that had haunted him since that August morning. He rarely spoke about his experiences during the conflict, and when asked about Hiroshima, he would simply say that he had been stationed nearby and had seen the aftermath. It was not a lie, but it was far from the complete truth. In 1985, on the 40th anniversary of the event, Nakamura was contacted by a historian writing a comprehensive account of the Hiroshima mission from multiple perspectives. After considerable hesitation, he agreed to be interviewed. Over several days, he recounted every detail he could remember of those 43 minutes. The appearance of the blips on his screen, the routine nature of the initial contact, the unexpected turn, the catastrophic failure of all his instruments, the emergence into a transformed world. The historian recorded everything, asking clarifying questions and cross-referencing Nakamura's account with other sources to ensure accuracy. When the interview was complete, the historian asked Nakamura what he hoped people would understand from his account. Nakamura thought for a long time before answering. He said that he hoped people would understand that the future does not announce itself. It does not send warnings or ask permission. It simply arrives, and those who are present must do their best to understand and adapt. He said that he and Lieutenant Yamamoto had been good at their jobs, diligent and professional and alert, and it had not been enough to prepare them for what was coming. And he said that if there was any lesson in his experience, it was that human beings must always remain humble in the face of what they do not yet know, because history has a way of making our certainties obsolete in an instant. Lieutenant Yamamoto did not survive to share his perspective. He succumbed in 1962 to a cancer that his physicians believed was related to radiation exposure from those terrible days after the weapon was used. His son, the boy who had never received his birthday eggs, grew up to become a physician himself, specializing in the treatment of radiation-related illnesses. He spent his career at a hospital in Hiroshima, caring for survivors and their descendants, trying to heal wounds that his father had inadvertently contributed to by being unable to stop what could not have been stopped. The radar station where Nakamura and Yamamoto had tracked the single aircraft was eventually dismantled, its equipment scrapped and its bunker filled in. Today, the site is part of a municipal park where children play and families picnic, unaware of what once occurred on that hillside. There is no marker or memorial to indicate that this was the place where two men watched history approach and tried their best to understand it. The evidence has been erased, as evidence so often is, leaving only the accounts of those who were present to testify to what happened there. But in another sense, the evidence remains everywhere. The event that Nakamura watched approaching on his radar screen that morning did not simply destroy a city. It transformed the entire framework within which human beings understood conflict, power, and survival. It inaugurated an age of anxiety that would persist for generations as nations raced to develop their own versions of the weapon and the world learned to live under the shadow of potential annihilation. It created categories of experience, survivor, downwinder, hibakusha, that had not existed before and that would come to define millions of lives. It posed questions that humanity has still not answered about the relationship between scientific knowledge and moral responsibility, about the limits of what nations can legitimately do to one another in the name of victory, about whether some weapons are too terrible ever to use, regardless of the circumstances. None of these consequences were visible on Corporal Nakamura's radar screen that morning. All he saw were 3 small blips, then one, then the turning maneuver that signaled something unexpected was occurring. The 43 minutes between that first contact and the detonation were filled with ordinary actions and ordinary thoughts. Logging the contact, notifying headquarters, anticipating the end of his shift, wondering what his family was doing back in Osaka. The weapon that was falling toward the city was invisible to his instruments and incomprehensible to his understanding. He was a trained professional doing his job with competence and dedication, and history was about to render all of it irrelevant. This, perhaps, is the most important thing to understand about those 43 minutes. They were not filled with dramatic tension or mounting dread or the awareness that the world was about to change. They were filled with routine, with boredom, with mild curiosity about an aircraft that was behaving unusually but not alarmingly. The men who lived through those minutes had no way of knowing that they were witnessing the approach of the most destructive weapon ever used against human beings. They had no way of knowing that their instruments, their training, and their expertise were utterly inadequate for the challenge they faced. They had no way of knowing that in less than an hour, they would emerge from their bunker into a world that could never be unchanged. Corporal Takeshi Nakamura lived until 2003, passing away quietly at a hospital in Osaka at the age of 81. His obituary mentioned his career as a mathematics teacher and his devotion to his students and family. It did not mention the 43 minutes that had defined the trajectory of his entire life, the minutes when he had watched something approaching that he could not stop and could not understand, the minutes that had taught him more about the limitations of human knowledge than all the equations he would subsequently spend his life teaching. In the end, perhaps that is the most important lesson of his story. Not the technical details of radar operation or the physics of nuclear fission, but the simple human truth that we can only understand what our experience has prepared us to understand. Nakamura was not prepared for what he witnessed that morning. No one was. And when the unprecedented arrives, all we can do is watch it approach and hope that we will somehow find the wisdom to respond to it appropriately. The 43 minutes that Corporal Nakamura spent tracking that single aircraft have become part of the permanent record of human history. They remind us that the boundary between the ordinary and the extraordinary can be crossed in an instant without warning or preparation. They remind us that vigilance is necessary but not sufficient, that expertise has limits, that the future will always contain surprises we cannot anticipate. And they remind us that the consequences of our actions can extend far beyond what we intend or imagine, shaping the world for generations in ways we cannot foresee. On August 6, 1945, a young corporal sat in a concrete bunker and watched 3 blips appear on his radar screen. He logged the contact, assessed the threat level, and prepared to finish his shift. In 43 minutes, everything he knew about the world would be proven wrong. And in the years that followed, he would spend the rest of his life trying to understand what it meant to have been present at the moment when the future arrived, without warning, and changed everything forever. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Do not forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.